You're listening to The Coffee Hour. I'm Andy Bates.
I'm Tiffany Manor.
Hey, Tiffany. Thanks for sitting in. Sarah's away, so Tiffany's sitting in to help out with these first few episodes of Mental Health Monday this year. And I'm really excited because we have a new book to dig into for Mental Health Mondays. And this is also in your wheelhouse because you serve in life ministry, which also cares for the whole body, including mental health, right?
Yep, absolutely.
So we're grateful to have your help during these first few episodes here in Mental Health Mondays. And also thanks to Concordia University, Wisconsin for supporting the Coffee Hour. You can find out more about Concordia University, Wisconsin at cuw.edu. Live Uncommon. Joining us today, Dr. Stephen Saunders. He's the Schneider Endowed Distinguished Professor of Psychology at Marquette University. He's also author of Martin Luther on Mental Health, Practical Advice for Christians Today from Concordia Publishing House. Dr. Saunders, welcome to the Coffee Hour.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
We are so grateful to have you alongside us as our guest during this season to take a look at your new book, Martin Luther on Mental Health, Practical Advice for Christians Today. I'm looking forward to digging into that as part of the series for mental health. Before we even get into that book, tell us a little bit about your background and how you serve as a mental health professional today.
Sure. Well, my background is I grew up Catholic, as most good Lutherans did. And I grew up Catholic. I went to Northwestern University, which is in Evanston, Illinois. That was my undergrad, and met the woman who would become my wife. And both of us got into graduate school at Northwestern. So we stayed. I went into graduate school for psychology to become a clinical psychologist. I have a doctorate or a PhD in clinical psychology. And, we can talk a little bit about the different mental health professionals. And I have a PhD, which is one of the 3 or 4 versions of getting a doctorate to become a mental health professional. There are, I think, 6 or 7 versions of getting a master's of becoming a mental health professional. I did a couple of years as a practitioner before, meaning seeing patients 30 hours a week for individual or couples or the occasional family session of therapy or counseling. Those mean the same thing. Therapy and counseling are the same. Psychotherapy is the same as that. Talk therapy, basically. So after that, I continued to do research and to publish, which is what academics do. Someone who is a professor somewhere, they're in academia, academic publish. And so I continued to do that even though I wasn't in the academy, and got an offer to join the faculty at Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, just down the road from Concordia University of Wisconsin. So joined them back in 1994 as an assistant professor and as a clinical psychologist. I got my clinical degree and then a license first in Minnesota. And then when I moved to Marquette, I got a license as a psychologist in Wisconsin. And so I joined the faculty because they were starting a brand new program, a doctoral program in clinical psychology, just like the one I graduated from 5 years earlier. And I became part of that, training students who are in the doctoral program to become clinical psychologists. And during that time as well, I continued to practice on a much smaller scale, and 5 persons a week versus 30 or so persons a week. And I think it's important to do what you teach. And so I was teaching clinical psychology. I was teaching graduate students, but also undergraduate students. Taught a number of different courses to undergrad as well. And so I just really like it. So probably the main thing I do is I help to run the doctoral program in clinical psychology. I was the director of it for a while, organizing what classes are taught when, by whom, organizing how we evaluate whether students are learning or not, and where to send them for training and so forth. But also teaching the classic teaching in the classroom, and continued to do research and progressed in my academic career from assistant to associate professor. And now I'm full professor of Psychology at Marquette and continue to work with the program, both undergrad and grad student.
And obviously you still write and have published multiple books, but your most recent is Martin Luther on Mental Health. So it would be really fantastic if we could all learn why it was important to you to write that particular book.
Well, it was a real pleasure to write. One of the things, you go to college to study, but when you're on the other side of the podium, professor, you continue to study as well. So it was really fun to study about Luther and to write that book. I'll give the short version of a 15-year story, which is, I'm as I said, a clinical psychologist, and the family that I married into, I married the daughter of Robert Preuss, who is one of the better known theologians of the 20th century within Lutheranism, but also beyond that. Robert was, of course, a minister, a pastor, a college professor. He and his wife Donna had lots of children, including my wife, Ruth, and they, many of them became pastors. But starting, I don't know, maybe 5 years into my career at Marquette, I would get phone calls ever so often, every other month or so, from a pastor, brother-in-law, or someone who knew a brother-in-law, or a pastor that I'd met through a brother-in-law. And they would ask about someone in their congregation that they were concerned about or confused about, or having some difficulty helping. And found myself giving advice related to what sounds like this might be an issue of trauma or depression or anxiety or something more serious. And, after about 8 years of this, I started to realize, no offense to anyone I gave advice to, but I started to realize I'm not really even listening to the questions anymore. I'm just giving advice because, I'm not going to call it basic advice, but it was, it was advice I'd been practicing, teaching with my own graduate students and undergrads as well. But I found myself giving the same advice. This is what this sounds like, and this is how you can help, and this is how you can find out if you're helping, and this is how you refer someone to a mental health professional. And 10 years of this, I realized I have a book here that, between the teaching that I'd been, the formal teaching and this advice giving, I realized two things. First, pastors really are on the front lines of mental health care. If you think about it, if someone is struggling with depression or anxiety, or their child has anxiety or an illness, or, a brother or a sister or a parent who starts to develop dementia, Alzheimer's, someone, of course, I like to emphasize the word of course, will turn to that place, which is the source of so much comfort and joy both, but largely comfort especially in times of difficulty, which is their church. The church is where they hear their sins are forgiven. The church is where they bury their parents. They marry their children. They baptize their children. The church is where so many important things happen to people that are so immensely powerful. So, of course, they turn to their pastors. And pastors are, I think we can all agree, pastors are very busy people. Pastors are really good at what they do, and pastors are happy to help to the extent that they can. But they don't have what I have, which is 5 years of training to become a mental health professional. They have, some coursework, of course, and they learn from experience, but often find themselves sort of unsure as to what to do, what I'm seeing. How do I help? And so I was giving this advice, and I wrote a couple of books published by our colleagues in Wisconsin Synod. Northwestern Publishing, A Christian Guide to Mental Illness. And one of the books was about how to recognize mental illness, and the other was, what do we do with someone who has a mental illness or a mental health problem? Writing those, I did some research, or I actually literally came across some of what Martin Luther had written to people who had mental health problems. Luther, digging into it, I came to realize Luther wrote thousands of letters. We have thousands of letters that Luther wrote. Probably not nearly as many, not nearly all of them. We have few that he received. I think, I like to joke that Luther used letters that he got, which must have been many, many. Probably used them for his fireplace, to keep warm in the winter. But anyone who got a letter from Luther kept it. And so we have so many of his letters, and so many of them are about mental health problems, depression, anxiety, suicidal thinking, even anger problems. He wrote a letter, saying you need to understand that this man has a problem with alcohol. So many words. And the advice that he gave, this is what astonished me. Of course, he was a pastor. He was a theologian, of course. But even his theology was, it was pastoral. It was caring for his congregation, for the sheep in his congregation, his flock. It was loving them, caring for them, and dedicating every ounce of his reserves to helping them, and including people, at a distance who he wrote to and gave advice. And what was astonishing is the advice that he gave is the advice that I was giving. It was the advice that I was teaching my students to give. And so I ended up realizing, after I finished the first two books, I realized, I've got to write this book about Martin Luther, because who's going to listen to me? But maybe they'll listen to him if I tell them what he said. And literally, that was the impetus.
We're talking with Dr. Stephen Saunders of Marquette University and author of Martin Luther on Mental Health. We'll continue the conversation here on Mental Health Monday on the Coffee Hour in just a moment. I'm Andy Bates.
I'm Tiffany Manor.
At Concordia University, Wisconsin, we believe you were created for a reason: to use your God-given gifts to help others, to live a life of self-sacrifice in a me-first world, to live a life that's uncommon. Whether you're taking one of 50-plus online programs or learning with us in person on the shores of Lake Michigan, you'll be equipped to make an uncommon impact. Learn more at cuw.edu. Concordia University, Wisconsin. Live uncommon.
Showing support for KFUO is now easier than ever. You can sport a KFUO shirt, swag, or even socks by visiting our online store. Go to kfuo.org/store and order high-quality KFUO-branded merch. You no longer need to wait for our annual share-a-thon for a chance to show your KFUO spirit. Visually share and wear this ministry out in the world by checking out our selection. Every purchase helps to support our proclamation of Christ for you, anytime, anywhere. Go to kfuo.org/store.
Welcome back to the Coffee Hour. I'm Andy Bates.
I'm Tiffany Manor.
It is Mental Health Monday. Our guest is Dr. Stephen Saunders. He is the Schneider Endowed Distinguished Professor of Psychology at Marquette University and author of Martin Luther on Mental Health, Practical Advice for Christians Today. Dr. Saunders is a professional clinical psychologist, and he's pleased to offer ideas and suggestions about mental health and mental health problems in these conversations. It's important, though, to understand that while his most important advice is to get professional help when you need it. So nothing said in our conversation today or in future Mental Health Monday episodes should be taken as therapy or treatment or as a substitute for personal consultation with a professional. So we'll continue our conversation here with Dr. Saunders. Dr. Saunders, who did you have in mind as you were writing this book, Martin Luther on Mental Health? Who was your target audience?
The first two books were really intended for pastors, teachers, deaconesses, the professional that might be turned to. This one it is also for all of those, but also I think for laypersons. I tried to make it a bit more accessible because, Luther was not a mental health professional. He was giving advice, and like the letters that he wrote were very interesting when he was writing the equivalent of a police officer. He was using very firm, strong, militaristic language, practically giving this man orders about his depression and his suicidal thinking, whereas with others, with the wives of friends, with young adults, they're barely out of what we now call adolescence, much more, careful about not being directive or sounding harsh. So I hope that this book is accessible to really anybody who would like to read it, layperson, mom, dad, grandma, grandpa. I hope even adolescents will be able to get something out of it. I really try to weave Luther's story into the book, not just the advice he gave, but also his own personal experiences. As much as I could, his sense of humor, which, that part of reading his letter was seeing how he was teasing. He loved to tease Catherine, his wife. He was away often. Wrote a lot of letters, went on a lot of journeys, so we have lots of letters from Luther to Catherine. Really should be its own book someday. So I hope this book I hope the book will prove useful to really anyone who wants to understand their own mental health or who wants to help someone, a friend, family member, who they think might be experiencing some mental health problem.
One thing that I loved about the book is that it's making Luther accessible really to anyone. So you don't have to be a pastor with the full collection of Luther's works on your shelf, which, a lot of pastors have those red books or congregations, but you're helping anyone access what Martin Luther has written. So that's really fantastic. But there's other things that are, really important beyond what Luther has written for, the reader and the listeners to us today to understand. Could you help us understand, really what mental illness is, what a mental health problem is, if there's a difference between the two of those, even some risk factors for mental illness and some of those things in a not a full class that you offer to your students, but in a few minutes here with our listeners.
Yeah, I will do my best. And something you were implying, didn't quite say, but I'll just say explicitly, you really do have to be careful about the information that you access. There's a lot of garbage out there. Anyone can say anything to everyone around the world if they have a Twitter account or an Instagram account. And so there's so much of it out there. It's so misguided, sometimes purposefully misguided. Anyway, I've used a couple of terms and I kind of use them interchangeably, even though they're not: mental health problems and mental illness. Mental illness is really the diagnosable, if you will, version of a mental health problem. For example, there's headache. Occasionally I get a headache. I never had, however, a migraine. That's sort of a severe version of headaches is migraine. You can actually look up the criteria for a migraine and see what that looks like. Whereas a headache is just, it could be in the front of your head, the back of your head, around your sinuses, and etc. So mental health problems, severe mental health problems, if a mental health problem gets severe enough, it will be diagnosed as a mental illness, or it can be diagnosed really as with any, as with any medical or mental health problem. A diagnosis is best done by professional. But easy to find the criteria and say, I think I might have this mental illness, and go talk to someone. Go talk with your primary care physician, see a social worker, see a psychologist directly, and talk to them about it. Mental illness really, it's there are different types of mental illnesses. There are different categories of mental illnesses. We have schizophrenia, for example, which is not the same as major depression, or which is not the same as generalized anxiety disorder or anorexia nervosa. All of these different mental illnesses, what we call the particular distress or presentation that someone has when they come into our office, is based on what the particular symptoms they are having. Symptoms such as persistent sadness, not being able to sleep at night, being easily startled, having nightmares at night about something that you went through. Someone with bipolar disorder, which we used to call manic depression, that person will have periods where they're profoundly depressed, but also periods where they are so-called in a manic state, or having a manic episode where they're very happy, very talkative, very energetic, to an extreme, to a problematic level. You know, they drive too fast, spend money that they don't have because nothing can possibly go wrong. So that's, someone with depression doesn't experience the manic episodes. They only get depressed. They have persistent sadness, difficulty sleeping, low self-esteem, feelings of guilt about things that they really shouldn't feel guilty about. Someone with schizophrenia will have perhaps delusions where they're thinking things that are not accurate. For example, a delusion of persecution is the idea that you have and you believe it, which is that other people are trying to hurt you. But if it's not reflective of reality, then they would refer to that as a delusion. They might also experience hallucination, where they are seeing things or hearing things, experiencing bodily sensation, perhaps like, for example, feeling that there's something crawling up your leg. A person with schizophrenia will have those particular symptoms. So schizophrenia, delusions, hallucination, depression, sadness, difficulty sleeping. And so the various symptoms will determine which mental illness you meet criteria for. In addition, these symptoms, they cause someone to experience a lot of distress. I mean, depression by definition is distressing. On the other hand, someone with mania, bipolar disorder, or what we used to call manic depression, someone in a manic phase, they're not distressed. They're the opposite of distress. So these symptoms might cause really serious distress, or they might cause the person to be really seriously impaired, or what is sometimes called dysfunctional. They're not able to get to work on time, concentrate while they're at work. And with depression, it's not uncommon for someone with severe depression to have trouble getting out of bed. Yeah, they spend much of the day in bed. Luther himself did that. There were a few episodes of that. There's the famous story of Luther was depressed and laid up in bed for a couple of days until finally Katie appears in his doorway wearing a black dress. And Luther looks at her and says, "Well, why are you wearing a black dress?" And she said, "Well, I'm in mourning." And Luther said, "Well, who died?" Katie said, "Well, God must have died, because why else would you be so depressed and lying in bed all this time?" Luther replied, "Foolish woman," and he got out of bed. So, we have the symptoms that cause distress, that cause impairment, maybe either of those or maybe both. Someone who's in a manic state, I implied this earlier. Someone who's spending a lot of money because they figure, well, I'm going to be making $1 million in the next week or so, because they're in this manic state where they're not thinking clearly. They're practically delusional in their thinking. So mental illness is symptoms that cause distress, impairment, or both. Mental health problems are a little bit less severe, but they're still worth paying attention to. So the difference between someone who is diagnosed with depression and someone who is sad a lot but doesn't meet the criteria for diagnosis is whether they have 5 of 9 symptoms, 5 or more of the 9 symptoms that are listed as being the criteria, or they have maybe only 3 or 4. But if they only have 3 or 4, they don't meet criteria, but there's still distress. So this is the kid that goes to college and maybe doesn't meet criteria for depression, but is shy and she has trouble making friends and calls home unhappy. And look, she could use some help. She has maybe a mental health problem, but not fully diagnosable mental illness. The mom watching a child with autism, watching their child turn from 13 to 14 and you still have this profound illness. That mom is going to experience a mental health problem, distress on behalf of their child. Do we diagnose her with a mental illness? Probably not. Could she use help? I would say yes, she could. Maybe at least from her church, from pastor or deaconess, or from friends who can help her just to talk with her and sympathize and listen and to be with her in her distress. So back to the beginning, mental health problems severe mental health problems are what we call diagnosable mental illnesses. But, but even though someone doesn't have a full-blown diagnosable mental illness, they might still be experiencing pretty substantial mental health problems, which we can help them.
Next time, we'll take a look at what are the risk factors? What can be some of the things that contribute to mental health problems and mental illness as well? Our guest today, Dr. Stephen Saunders, is the Schneider Endowed Distinguished Professor of Psychology at Marquette University and author of Martin Luther on Mental Health, Practical Advice for Christians Today from Concordia Publishing House. Dr. Saunders, thanks for being our guest on the Coffee Hour today.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Coffee Hour. I'm Andy Bates.
I'm Tiffany Manor.
The Coffee Hour with Andy and Sarah is a production of KFUO. To support the Coffee Hour and KFUO Radio, visit KFUO.org. You can also text KFUO to 41444 or send an email to gifts@KFUO.org. And you can call us at 800-844-0524. KFUO. Christ for you, anytime, anywhere.